Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, Meeting the Moment, Strategic Recommendations for Literacy and Equity in North Carolina. I'm Dr. Hiller Spires, Executive Director of the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation at North Carolina State University. You know, it was almost a year ago that we at the Friday Institute decided to create space and time for a broader dialogue about literacy and equity in light of the strategic resources our state is devoting to early literacy. We believe that reading instruction needs to be viewed from an equity lens in order for each and every child to learn to read. And what do we mean specifically by equity? We mean that each and every child receives the support they need to be a successful reader. That seems like such a simple statement, but we know the effort and work it takes to pull that off. Along with our partners, we conducted a virtual summit in January, bringing together over 800 participants who articulated the ways in which our educational system falls short of serving all students. We continued our efforts by surveying North Carolina teachers about their literacy practices and ways they think our system can be improved. And that data is the basis for our policy brief. So today, we'll share highlights from the brief, and you can find the link to the brief in the chat. And following, we will have a response to the strategic recommendations by our discussant, Dr. Deanna Townsend Smith. We'll then invite questions from our audience members who teach, advocate for, and champion lifelong competent readers in North Carolina. You know, it's great to see so many of you joining us today. Thank you so much for being here. We'd like for you to take a moment and tell us who you are and what you see as your greatest literacy needs upcoming this year. So if you would, take a minute and flood the chat, and we're gonna just see who all is here and what's on your mind. Let's see. Do we have anyone flooding the chat yet? I'll wait a moment. Jen, are we able to see who's in the chat? We've got Rebecca Davis, and she's joining from Elon, and she's looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Rebecca. Executive Director for Instructional Services in Clinton. Okay, hopefully we'll have a few more. We've got Amy Walter. She's excited to learn more about our findings. Cindy DeFore from Wake County Public Schools. Melissa Raspberry. Ann Jolly from Charlotte, excited to hear more about the report and implications that she can support. Thank you, Ann. Okay, hopefully we'll have some more joining us in the chat. Thank you so much for your participation. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves now, and I'm going to start with Dr. Sarah Bassell.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Balsell, a researcher at the Friday Institute. And prior to my time here, I was a high school English teacher for over a decade. Happy to be here. Marie?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marie Himes, also a researcher at the Friday Institute with the New Literacies Collaborative. Look forward to digging into this brief with you all today. Dr. Callie Womble-Edwards.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Callie Edwards. I am the Associate Director of Program Evaluation and Education Research at the Friday Institute. I've been doing research and evaluation for just over a decade and very excited to be here. And now I will turn over to my colleague, Dr. Davis.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Davis. I'm an associate professor in the College of Education at NC State. And now I will turn it over to Rupen.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ruben Fafaria, an education reporter at ednc.org, and I cover learning differences and equity.
Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. You know, in the last decade, North Carolina has made significant efforts to support student literacy growth. And despite these efforts, student reading scores continue to demand our collective attention. According to the recent NAEP scores, 64% of fourth graders and 67% of eighth graders in North Carolina scored below proficiency level in reading. The pandemic, of course, has exacerbated longstanding inequities and made the already complex work of teaching reading even more challenging. We know that becoming a better reader is a lifelong process. The NAEP scores are only one measure. Students need consistent opportunities to nurture their love for reading and grow their capacity for reading each year. Based on decades of research, we know that literacy is a social practice and can't be taught or learned in a vacuum. And we believe that it requires a vibrant literacy learning ecosystem. You know, we chose this metaphor of ecosystem to describe the context that readers emerge because an ecosystem is a dynamic, complex, interconnected network. Our diagram here is an effort to visualize the various components of the literacy learning ecosystem. And I will say it was a challenge for us as we tried to list all of the different components and how they relate to each other, but this was our effort to do it. So we're very interested in your feedback. When we think about the ecosystem, at the center, we place lifelong competent readers. We emphasize lifelong because we recognize that we can't, or that we continue to develop as readers long after formal schooling ends. The next layer focuses on motivation, engagement, and representation. We know that these are important elements. Readers need instruction that motivates and engages them. We know that students thrive with instruction that affirms their multiple identities. So we must continually ask the question, how do teachers and the text that they use to teach reading affirm students' cultural, racial, and linguistic identities, to name a few? And then connected to motivation, engagement, and representation are the critical components of reading. Word reading, which includes phonemic awareness and phonics. Early comprehension, which is making meaning of text beyond the word level. And what we're calling higher order reading, which includes critical, disciplinary, digital literacies, among many others. It was very challenging to try to simplify what all goes on in reading in a very small diagram. Now, essential to the ecosystem are equitable access and opportunities, along with equitable funding. We know how essential these elements are. And then finally, if you go to the outer perimeter of the ecosystem, we have the different groups that are instrumental in supporting each and every child becoming a lifelong competent reader. Schools and school personnel, and of course that's comprised of classroom teachers, specialists, instructional coaches, administrators. And then we have the pre and in-service educator learning. And that of course includes institutions of higher education, alternative pathways to practice, professional development, and it goes on. And then we have local, state, and federal policymakers. We have seen in recent years how instrumental these folks can be in terms of shaping the literacy landscape for our state. Communities and nonprofits are very important. For example, public libraries, museums, community organizations, philanthropic foundations, all vital to our ecosystem. And then, of course, finally, families and caregivers who are extremely important to the ecosystem. That's a lot of information, but I hope you'll start thinking about that ecosystem, and hopefully you'll have some more comments to make about the ecosystem for us in our discussion. At its best, the literacy learning ecosystem generates open lines of strategic communication and aligned complementary supports toward each and every child learning to read. That, of course, would be the ideal. So now that you have a gist of the literacy learning ecosystem, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Dr. Sarah Bussell, and she's going to tell us about the methods we use to tell the story of literacy and equity in North Carolina. Sarah?
Thanks, Taylor. Indeed, it's an extremely complex time. Teaching reading has always required tremendous stamina, even more so today. The team you're hearing from today, as well as others who aren't represented on the panel, but certainly contributed to it, operated under the belief that the people closest to the work should always have their voices elevated in policy decisions. So we worked together as a team representing 5 different educational organizations to survey teachers across North Carolina to find out what are they experiencing with reading instruction right now, what are their resource needs, and what ideas do they have about improving instruction for students in North Carolina. Next, please, thanks. So I won't go into too much detail, but if you're interested, please read the policy brief carefully for more research information. But just as an overview, we developed a survey. We used concurrent mixed methods approach and snowball sampling to maximize diversity of responses. We did hear from 332 educators. And to deepen our understanding of those findings and to contextualize those, we held 19 role-alike focus groups. And in those groups, we shared some of our preliminary findings and heard back from teachers. So we let them filter their responses back. And to make sense of the data, we ran descriptive statistics and used constant comparative technique. Again, please read the brief in full to get some commentary on limitations of this design, but to pass it on to my colleague, Marie Himes, as she gets us started on what we learned from teachers.
Thank you, Sarah. Sample themes from the qualitative data were grouped into 5 broader dimensions for readability purposes within the brief. Each dimension included qualitative and quantitative findings that are central to the what's and how's of North Carolina educators' reading and literacy practices. Like Sarah mentioned, I'm going to also be sharing highlights from our findings for the first 3 dimensions, and then we'll be turning it over to my colleague, Dr. Edwards, for dimensions 4 and 5. Dimension 1 focused on what teachers were seeing in terms of student reading post-emergency remote learning and teachers' reflections about their capacity to meet specific student reading needs. Keeping North Carolina's goal for all students to be reading at grade level in mind, the North Carolina educators in our study reported worrying levels of reading difficulty among students. For example, in the pre-K 5 grade band, roughly 3 out of 10 educators reported that more than 60% of their students are not reading at grade level. These numbers increased at the 6-12 grade band, with roughly 4 out of 10 educators reporting more than 60% of their students not reading at grade level. Of particular concern among the educators we spoke with was K2 student reading progress and the long-term implications of this. With one North Carolina pre-K teacher sharing, they've, referring to pre-K 2 learners, missed out on a big chunk of their literacy instruction in school. It's going to hurt us for a while. Dimension 2, instructional literacy practices, covered respondents' instructional approaches to meeting student reading needs, including the continual and purposeful assessment of reading instruction. In this vein, pre-K 5 teacher respondents on the questionnaire reported utilizing a variety of tools and strategies to assess student reading. Most commonly, they indicated depending on teacher-made diagnostics, MClass and other standardized data, and their own observations. At the secondary band, educators tended to rely slightly more on their own professional opinion than on standardized data. Like their elementary counterparts, secondary teachers reported rarely consulting with other teachers to assess student reading. In terms of qualitative data, North Carolina educators indicated substantially different assessment practices dependent on grade band, with pre-K-5 educators describing assessment and data overload, while 6-12 educators reported a lack of resources and knowledge to meet student reading needs while grappling with how to teach reading and simultaneously deliver content. One North Carolina high school teacher highlighted this tension, stating, "When a student is struggling to read the material in my class, I deliver the material in a different way. They may end up understanding the social studies standards, but I'm not convinced their reading improves." With Dimension 3, Professional Development and Literacy, this summarizes teacher engagement in reading professional development during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ongoing professional development has been and continues to be a cornerstone of teachers' practice as they work to understand and transfer evolving literacy research into their classrooms. Over the past 2 years, 65% of pre-K-12 teacher respondents on the Literacy and Equity Questionnaire reported spending about the same amount of time or a little more in professional development to support students who were not reading at grade level as compared to previous years. Despite this ongoing investment in professional development, 36% of pre-K-5 and 61% of 6-12 educators either did not feel up to date or were unsure if they were up to date on research-based strategies for supporting students who read below grade level. Between 2021 and 2025, the number of literacy professional development hours will increase substantially for North Carolina pre-K-5 teachers with the state's rollout of letters training, with K-5 teachers completing an estimated 137.5 to 168 hours and pre-K educators slated for 32 to 37.5 hours of professional development in the fundamentals of reading instruction. Though letters training is in its early stages of implementation, some focus group participants in the pre-K-5 grade band currently engaged in the training indicated that they are enthusiastic about the quality and utility of the modules. One district level instructional coach noted, "What I'm learning while supporting my teachers with letters training is that some never felt confident with teaching reading." Additionally, some focus group participants expressed a need for compensated think time in order to effectively apply the lessons learned through this training in their classrooms. One literacy coordinator commented, "There's a lot of pressure on classroom teachers and classroom staff to do this work," referring to letters training. "We can go back to the fact that they're not paid enough, they're not given enough release time to think and to plan." My colleague, Dr. Callie Womble-Edwards, will now share highlighted findings with Dimensions 4 and 5.
Thank you, Marie. So Dimension 4, literacy resources. This really highlights respondents' perception of any text, tools, or other resources that were made available to them to meet the needs of students. We know that access to appropriate student-facing and teacher-facing instructional resources is critical to reading development. In our report, we provide a nuanced discussion of both types of resources. However, for purposes of our brief time together on this webinar, I will highlight the student-facing resources. We found that fewer than half of respondents overall were satisfied with the availability of texts in their school media centers that represent diverse racial, ethnic, gender, and linguistic identities. The lowest level of satisfaction was with the availability of linguistically diverse texts. One of our key findings in this dimension was that ongoing staff shortages led to these prominent literacy resource discrepancies. And this was perhaps best illustrated by the quote that you see on the screen, which emerged from an interview with a district level literacy coach. They noted, in part, large subgroups of struggling readers exist in a school or district. Nothing is going to impact nothing is going to approach the impact that direct instruction will have on the reader's progress. We need to add additional adults to the classroom who are knowledgeable in reading development and promote research-based literacy practices. Next slide. Thank you. In terms of Dimension 5, collaboration and communication in support of literacy, this calls to attention how respondents connect with colleagues, with families, and with outside organizations to extend literacy learning with their students. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has influenced countless areas of the educational landscape, including how stakeholders communicate and collaborate around literacy. We found a great deal of role-alike collaboration amongst respondents as they plan instruction for students who read below grade level, such as working in grade level teams and collaborating by content area and by grade level. What was interesting is that on the other hand, teacher respondents reported less frequent collaboration with media specialists and with ESL educators. One key finding I'd like to highlight from this dimension is the urgency and the challenge of facilitating reading-focused conversations with families. In our questionnaire, only half of pre-K 5 educators and less than a quarter of 6-12 educators reported feeling equipped to communicate with families around the school's approaches to reading instruction, as well as meeting learner needs. And so the quote you see on the screen comes from an elementary educator, and it further illuminates this phenomenon. Simply stated by the educator in part, we don't seem to have the difficult conversations. No one wants to have these conversations. And that really resonated with us in our findings. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Dennis Davis to walk us through our recommendations.
All right, thank you. So across the 5 dimensions that emerged in the data that my colleagues have already described, what we tried to do in this report is synthesize 6 recommendations that that center the voices and needs of North Carolina educators and can help us strengthen the literacy learning ecosystem for all learners. So I'm going to briefly talk through the first 3 recommendations, and then my colleague Rupen Fofaria will talk about the final 3. So our first recommendation is to establish system-level supports to sustain instructional improvements in reading. And I would say the important word here is to sustain. We already know that North Carolina has made tremendous investments, and our North Carolina leaders have really made improvements in reading instruction a priority in our state. And so now we need to think about how can we make sure that the benefits of that prioritization can be sustained and maximized among teachers. We've already mentioned the letters training that is now required for all elementary teachers. And we know that is an investment in teachers' knowledge that will make them smarter and more informed about the current scientific basis for how to teach reading well to children. But there are some concerns about the amount of time and the resources that are needed to make sure that knowledge is fully translated into classroom practice. Letters is not a student-facing curriculum, right? It's a teacher development curriculum. And so we have to really think about what are the best ways to make sure that teacher knowledge gets built into practices and sustained for a long time. So in the report, we're recommending that there should be some coordinated compensation that will, in the form of stipends and release time for teachers, that can really help them share their knowledge with each other and make sure it's translated into practice. We also highlight in the report that there are at least two ways that the implementation of effective reading instruction can be further sustained. And those 2 ways are literacy coaching and professional learning communities. We are concerned that that literacy coaching and the literacy coach role is not defined very clearly at the state level. And also there is a need for some creative funding models to make sure that there can be equitable distribution of literacy coaches across the state at the school level, because it would be ideal to have literacy coaches in every school in North Carolina. A lot of schools are already using professional learning communities or some similar school improvement strategy, and we think that it would be useful to kind of capitalize on those PLCs and develop ways for teachers to use those as a space to work together as they implement what they're learning about the science of reading, but also integrate it with what they already know locally about their school communities so that they can implement the science of reading in culturally, racially, and linguistically sustaining ways. Our second recommendation has to do with older students. So we're recommending that we optimize the state's investment in pre-K-5 literacy and think about how we can also meet the needs of students in grades 6 through 12. We all know that reading development does not stop after elementary school. There's a lot to learn about reading as you get older. As Hiller pointed out in the ecosystem model that she was showing, we can think about many different facets of reading development, including word reading, higher level reading, and then early comprehension skills. And when we think about middle and high school, we naturally think about those higher order reading comprehension skills, but we know there are many students in those grades who also need support with word reading and also early comprehension. So we want to make sure that those students' needs are being met. We made 3 recommendations in the report. First, it can be beneficial to have a designated state level committee that could really strategize and think through what would it take, what would be needed to really connect those early reading skills and teacher development in those how to teach those early reading skills within the content areas for 6 through 12 teachers and students, because that is sort of a difficulty that teachers face in the older grades. They have a commitment and a desire to teach their content, but they also know that they need to support students in their reading skills as well, and integrating those can be challenging. We also recommend, you're probably familiar with the DPI's Promising Practices Clearinghouse, which is a place where the state is trying to build up a repertoire of exciting things happening across the state in different areas of education. And we think that clearinghouse could really be leveraged to identify and lift up models of really effective 6 through 12 reading instruction that are helping students build reading skills integrated with content. And then, of course, all of this requires expanding appropriate literacy professional development opportunities for middle and high school teachers. We want to be really clear here that we're not recommending that we just take letters and have older teachers do it, right? Middle and high school are different contexts. The teaching of reading in those contexts is different. Those are different ecosystems, to use our metaphor. So we would need, there need to be some creative thinking about what exactly do teachers need to know in working with adolescents. Some of the knowledge related to the early science of reading is applicable, but it has to be kind of translated into a middle and high school context. And then our third recommendation, I'll say this one really briefly, we also need to deepen our investments in pre-K literacy. Just like reading doesn't stop after elementary school, reading development doesn't start at kindergarten, right? It starts much earlier than that, with the language and literacy experiences that children have earlier before their kindergarten age. And so we're recommending really thinking about how we can do appropriate vertical alignment or vertical integration of evidence-based literacy instruction, beginning in pre-K and then moving into kindergarten and beyond. And then, of course, expanding the availability of pre-K education so that we could serve all students across North Carolina through an equity lens. That's a really important thing to think about in terms of access to really high quality pre-K education. And now I will turn it over to Rupin for our remaining recommendations.
Thank you. So recommendation 4 is coordinating reading diagnostic and intervention resources for 6 through 12 students and teachers in MTSS. We know that we have a lot of striving readers in our middle and high schools. And Dr. Davis is right. It is a different ecosystem at those grade levels, but we do also know that it's not just comprehension or oral language skills that are sometimes weak. We know we have many students who are still, striving to strengthen those decoding and word recognition skills. In some of the districts I've visited through my reporting, I'll see instructional coaching PLCs that are meeting weekly or bi-weekly, and these include both lower grade and upper grade coaches. And that allows those upper grade coaches in those districts to benefit from the training and resources that are provided to lower grade educators through North Carolina's new reading law, and particularly around interventions, whether it be the word recognition or language strands of the rope. This recommendation from the brief builds on that sort of intra-district sharing model and broadens it to an inter-district model. So statewide sharing via this open source MTSS database. And it would be refined on an ongoing basis and could include valid rapid diagnostics that can be used to better understand a student's reading strengths and needs, and then aligned evidence-based interventions and instructional strategies. Next, recommendation 5 is nurturing the literacy learning ecosystem through collaborations and communication. And in some ways, this is building off of recommendation 4 and looking at how to scale best practices. In states like Mississippi or Massachusetts or Florida, you see these centers for literacy, like the Barksdale Institute in Mississippi or Mass Literacy in Massachusetts. And one of the most important functions they provide is they can act as network connectors to match someone who needs help with those who can provide help. But we don't have that sort of center for literacy in North Carolina. And so here the brief is recommending leveraging things like, as Dr. Davis said earlier, DPI's Promising Practices Clearinghouse. And now listen, just to add to what Dr. Davis is saying, this is to the extent that someone is reviewing these, promising practices to make sure that they are aligned with our goals for literacy instruction. And the brief is also recommending that these be asset-based. So the practices that we're lifting up are looking at the gifts within diversity of student population and how districts are serving diverse populations within the community. Second, we've got refined literacy intervention plans to include how specific school personnel will collaborate. And so, in recommendation 4, we talk about how, connecting districts with each other around MTSS and interventions, but this is being specific around, what districts are doing, including not just what, but also who is working together to provide those interventions. And then let's go to recommendation 6. Recommendation 6 is championing families and caregivers within the literacy learning ecosystem. And what the brief is talking about here is developing open lines of both one-way and two-way communication. So initiatives from DPI, for instance, directed at serving parents, but also building awareness around how and why the new law, changes literacy instruction. I think there's a lot we can learn from the ecosystem. When families feel left out of the conversation, communication with schools and districts can stop, or they can become unproductive. But both educators and families are vital to student reading proficiency. And we have a number of community organizations, like, for instance, the Black Child Development Institute in Charlotte, who are working to bridge that gap and help parent voices get heard. And I think there's a wealth of information we could learn from these groups on how to improve relationships between families and schools and school systems. Listen, we're trying to run through this because we've got an hour, and I think we'll end the recommendations at this point. I just want to sort of recap the purpose of the Literacy and Equity Summit back in January. The purpose of the surveys and focus groups and this brief is really just to create a conversation, encourage implementation of things that are going to help us capitalize on the investments of the Excellent Public Schools Act. And so we hope you find this brief to be helpful, and we hope you'll put questions for us about anything you've heard or anything you saw in the brief in the chat. But at this time, I'm so excited about what's next. I get to introduce my friend. So I met Deanna Townsend Smith when I was a Cub education reporter, and she was director of board policy and operations for the State Board of Education at that time. If I had any question about what the board was doing or anything related to things they were contemplating, she very quickly became my go-to. And as the years went on and I attended board meetings regularly, I was surprised at how much I was learning, not just about what the board was up to, but about the education system itself. And at first I thought it was just the product of sitting and watching the board. What I came to realize is that it was the product of how those board meetings and the board's planning sessions were orchestrated. The learning doesn't just happen automatically. It happened because those meetings were designed to teach. And Deanna was the person designing those teachable moments. She is so many things, but I think what I admire most about her is she is a teacher at heart, and she teaches through her leadership. She is the very, very newly named Senior Director of the Dudley Flood Center for Educational Equity and Opportunity at the Public School Forum of North Carolina. And I can't wait to see what she teaches me next, both in that role and as I were discussing now.
Thank you so much, Rupen, for that, that introduction. Hope I do this justice today following that introduction. But I thank you all for this opportunity to be a part of this discussion today. If anyone knows anything about me, they know that equity is at the center of everything that I do, no matter the role, because it is ultimately the main priority to move anything forward. And as I had the opportunity to dig into these recommendations, I was drawn to the title and the graphic. This piece of meeting the moment, because the time is now, right? And then this piece of literacy and equity. The piece and the push of literacy and equity makes it clear that without equity, we will continue to reap the same results that have been reaped over time. Because I think it was Dennis who said earlier the importance of sustaining investments that we make in literacy. And so to be successful with literacy implementation, and I think that's the reason why we see some of the results that we have to do so with equity, because it is the basic and necessary need to fulfill the rights that's promised in our Constitution, right, of this sound basic education. And I reiterate again that for any initiative to be successful, we have to lead with equity. And at this moment, we have an opportunity to apply what we know to be true, what we know that our educators need, what our students need, like those in classrooms and those leading. It requires us to apply an equity lens to ensure that each and every, that key, I can't remember who said that earlier, this piece about each and every. We didn't say all, and that's intentional. That each and every individual receives what they need to eliminate the systemic barriers that hinder success. And so as I dug into the recommendations, 3 stood out to me. The first one, which was establishing system level supports to sustain instructional improvements in reading. The third, which was deepening investments in pre-K, because as our namesake says at the Dudley Flood Center, it starts at birth and it ends, it ends when we are no longer here. And this piece of that Rupen hit on a few minutes ago, which is championing families and caregivers within the literacy learning ecosystem, we have to partner with those who touch our children each and every day in order to be successful. So I was drawn to those three because those recommendations tie directly to the framework for change at the Dudley Flood Center, which consists of several core competencies that we almost must have and possess when leading with equity. We know that data is important, and it is important for us to collect, analyze, and report outcomes, right? And so like if you dig into the report, this is what you guys are doing here. We know that accountability is important, which is the second core competency, because that helps us with accuracy, with truth telling. It also helps us with this piece of expanding access and opportunity. And each and every one of you hit at this piece that I think it's not an easy conversation, but it's the necessary and right conversation around resource allocation. That's a hard conversation to have, but it's the conversation that we need to be having. And then the fourth core competency within that framework for change is engaging community and other stakeholders. So these, I found those three recommendations to be compelling because the framework for change at the Flood Center is grounded in research. And we all hear the same thing over and over again. And it's like, now is the time, now is that moment for us to start leading. And we know that change happens when we do the hard and necessary work. And at this moment, that hard and necessary work is equity and literacy. And when we operate without equity, we know that positive outcomes are not produced. And we know that systematic change can be achieved through framework like ours and by doing what you have highlighted and recommended with the recommendations that you've highlighted here today, because leading with equity is at the core and should be center of everything that we do. Ruben knows a lot about me. He mentioned earlier this piece about how I constructed the planning and work sessions for the State Board of Education. And I have a passion of connecting recent recommendations with other recommendations, other plans, right? Because it creates this synergy of sorts. And so as I focused on those three recommendations that I highlighted for you earlier, which was establishing system level supports to sustain instructional improvements in reading, deepening investments in pre-K literacy, and championing families and caregivers within the literacy ecosystem, I started to recall like other plans and other recommendations that I think are key here to highlight here today. So I don't know if many people participating here today know of the statewide strategic plan that was created by the State Board of Education, because they are the constitutional body that's responsible for ensuring a sound basic education. And so in 2019, the State Board of Education approved and implemented a statewide strategic plan, which this is continued opportunity for us to align initiatives. But they approved a strategic plan, which had 3 goals grounded in equity and whole child, which they sought to achieve by 2025. And I want you to listen to these goals that are in this plan and then make the links back to the 3 that I highlighted earlier. One is eliminating opportunity gaps. You can't do that without some of the things that you guys have already highlighted. Another one is improving school and district performance. And then the other one is increasing educator preparedness to meet the needs of every student. You highlighted pieces on professional development. You highlighted pieces of resources that schools and teachers needed. And then you highlighted the piece of having this ecosystem in place to eliminate opportunity gaps, right? And then my wheels kept turning because in 2020, the DRIVE Task Force, which stands for Developing a Representative and Inclusive Vision for Education, they highlighted 10 recommendations, 2 of which are key to developing and maintaining this literacy learning ecosystem that you've highlighted here this evening. And one of those recommendations was expanding and creating entry points for a diverse teacher workforce. Why is that important? That's important because students need to see themselves, because if you don't see yourself, you don't know what you can become, right? Representation matters. And this piece of intentionally embedding diversity goals into key performance indicators for schools and districts across the state. Like, research shows us that teacher diversity is paramount to the success of every student. And when there is teacher diversity, that impacts our overall economic success. It impacts how we operate in this thing we call democracy, in this experiment that we're living in democracy, right? And then students are able to gather information through literacy to expand their thinking. And I know, like, many of you probably don't know anything about this because it hasn't been in the news, and that I am being a little facetious there, but there was this longstanding, there's the longstanding Leandro case, right? The courts ordered a comprehensive remedial plan, which it received in 2021, to ensure that every child has a sound basic education. And we all know that literacy is key to that. And there were 7 key areas outlined in that plan. However, 3 components directly overlap with the recommendations that I highlighted. So the first one was a system of teacher development and recruitment that ensures each classroom is staffed with a high quality teacher who is supported with early and ongoing professional learning and provided competitive pay. I think it was Dennis who hit on this a little earlier. Like, I just want to reiterate that piece and want to highlight, in connection to the Leandro recommendations, we know that the professional development around the science of reading is strong, it's robust, but we have to look at time, the time needed for educators to complete that professional development as a resource. We talked about resource allocation, right? Time is a necessary resource. Mm-hmm. And compensating them appropriately for gaining this skill is important. We compensate our doctors, and we know that educators are the foundation to every other profession. So we need to make sure that we keep that in the forefront of our mind. Another recommendation from that comprehensive remedial plan, which was this finance system that provides adequate, equitable, and predictable funding to school districts. And importantly, adequate resources to address the needs of all North Carolina schools and students, especially at-risk students, as defined by Leandro. And that ties back to deepening investments in pre-K, what we need to do once they make it through elementary with literacy, and what they need to do once they get to 612. And the piece, the last recommendation from that was a system of early education that provides access to high quality pre-K and other early childhood learning opportunities to ensure that all students who are at risk of educational failure, regardless of where they live, enter kindergarten on track for school success. And this last piece I want to highlight, because these recommendations came out as late as April of 2022, I believe, from the Hunt-Lee Commission, which was a bipartisan group. They released 16 recommendations to improve education in North Carolina. Their recommendations said to reduce barriers to access for North Carolina pre-K, improve schools and districts' ability to respond to student needs, and strengthen our data, information, and sharing. And I'm highlighting these tonight because each of these plans, the reports, the recommendations, suggest a synergy around consistent need. It's not new. You know, we often experience situations in education where there's success in school and where there's success in a classroom or a district. And we sometimes wonder, I wonder what that magic sauce is. And I submit that that magic sauce is that basic needs are being met, right? And when we focus on meeting the basic needs for each and every, then individual opportunity, access is achieved, and learning is expanded. We get better outcomes, right? A need is not innovative. A need isn't innovative. A need is basic and should be applied to each and every. And we do that using an equity lens. But we must first remember that we have to provide the necessary resource allocation. And when we're talking about resource allocation, that is human, that is material, that is monetary. To address the work highlighted in this brief, which pointed to significant efforts in reading over the last decade, but we see that there are still inequities that persist. So from my perspective, these inequities will continue to persist unless we address what is core to optimal performance. And that is centering dignity, respect, and well-being, which is ultimately equity, right? Equity is the color of education. And it shows that we care and that we are willing to do what is necessary. We're willing to do what is necessary to meet the needs of each and every individual participating in this public education system. We have to be willing to address the underlying issues and correct the system issues in order for the strategies that we apply or develop to be successful. Our namesake, Dr. Flood, often says this: we already know what to do. We've studied it. But do we have the will to act, even when it's difficult? And I'll leave you with this today. I have a favorite quote by Miriam Wright Elderman, who once said that the question is not whether we can afford to invest in every child. It is whether we can afford not to, right? Equity is constant. Equity is a constant and consistent commitment. It's not a quick fix or something that you can move from. So once we start to see these scores move up from applying your recommendations because you've embedded equity there, we can't move from it. And at this moment, we have an opportunity to apply what we have learned through this research and other research and things that have been detailed in other plans and recommendations, and move literacy forward using equity-based approaches. And I leave you with this question. The question is, will we have the will to lead with equity? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deanna. We really appreciate your reflections and your insights. And I particularly appreciate how you looked across the other policy briefs and pointed out the connections to this particular one. I think that is very important. I think that the more we can create synthesis, the more power the work has. So I think that that's a valuable process. I really like also how you said we need to be centering dignity and respect within our education system and how that relates to equity, because that's really what equity is. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, so we've got about 6 minutes left. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. I'm going to turn it over and see if the audience has some questions they'd like to share with us. If you would put your questions in the chat. And while I'm waiting for those, I did want to ask the group a question about this diagram that we came up with for the literacy learning ecosystem. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that might be, that actual diagram might be able to be used as a tool, with educators, within districts, schools, to really have this full-blown conversation and actually put actions in place. Any thoughts on that while we wait for some questions? Everybody's shy today.
I'll speak.
All right, Sarah's not shy. Go for it, Sarah.
I'm speaking now as a mother of children in public schools and a teacher, former teacher as well, and as a researcher. When I look at that ecosystem, I just think, wow, I know as a classroom teacher, I misinterpreted the bulk of literacy instruction falling on me. And as a mother, you don't know what you don't know. And once you're a mother, you realize, or a caregiver, a parent, you realize how much of that literacy instruction belongs at home. And when we were analyzing that data and saw that over half of the respondents didn't feel comfortable and well equipped to meaningfully communicate with families about how they were approaching reading and how they could engage them in meaningful conversation, that's really alarming. So what I would like to see is this diagram being used at school levels so that we can think about, okay, how are we engaging families and what do we need to do to make sure that we're really building these relationships? So I could see it being used as like a needs assessment.
Thank you. Anybody else have an insight on that?
I've got some activity in the background. I hope that you guys aren't hearing that, but when I look at it, it's kind of like, just the visual of it at a glance is kind of like a compass. And that's what it really reminds me of. It's just sort of like, we look and we see all of the stakeholders, and are we meeting all of the stakeholders? Are we hearing, like really hearing all of the stakeholders? And the interconnectedness of all of it. Reading doesn't happen in any vacuum, in any one silo. And so, that was what really stuck out to me with the diagram, is just how each of the circles are interconnected, which is true of the stakeholders, if we're going to do the best and do right by the students.
Thank you, Reuben. Anybody else have an observation?
Hello, this is Deanna.
Yeah.
I was just struck by how the diagram really shows that when we come together, things are better. And much to the report, the piece that was just raised by Sarah, like truly engaging around this component of like using it as a needs assessment to like truly force ourselves as well to engage.
Right.
That's what struck me.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we've got a question from Rebecca Davis, and she said she was struck by how intertwined all of the classic dilemmas in education are, especially through the funding. I think that came from your synthesis, Deanna. She wanted to know what is our opinion of the level of determination of our state board and General Assembly to address literacy for all learners. I don't know if anyone has a window into that, but if someone would like to try to answer that, feel free to.
I'll tell you what, I'll answer around it.
Okay.
I'll try to answer. Listen, I think I've spoken to people at every level that impacts these levers. And so I think that there are members of the General Assembly who are very committed to this, to literacy. people at DPI, obviously, state board. But with the question of funding specifically, that's going to come from the General Assembly. The state board and DPI will have their requests. And I think that what we've seen in the recent history is a reluctance to just sort of completely open up the purses. Right now, we have something like a $6 billion surplus going into this short session, right? And so in odd number years, we pass a state budget, and in even number years, there's a short session where we adjust allocations for that budget. And we're going in with a huge surplus. But even now, I'm reading that fiscal discipline is, continuing fiscal discipline is really important. I think that there are some tension points. I think that, there's a lot of places the money can go. I think that, members of the General Assembly are representing voters who sometimes want that money to come back to them and want the state to do the most, to operate efficiently. But in listening to Deanna and in looking at what we have seen, I think it's safe to say that it's clear we're not funding at the levels we need to be. And so we do have to, I'm not saying we spend $6 billion on education during the short session, but for instance, one of the things that Dr. Davis went over when he was doing, I think it was recommendation 2, I cannot remember now, but it was around the coaching, and recently at the state board, Amy Ryan, who's the director of the Office of Early Learning, was presenting on our coaching plan, and where she was saying that it would have cost $133 million to put a coach in every school, and so instead we are putting 115 literacy specialists so that there's one in every district. And there's a few things that jump out to me about that. First of all, that's equal, right? Every district is getting one. But is it equity focused, right? Are we putting the resources where they are most needed? And number 2, there's a wide gap between 133 million and 6 billion. And so why do we write it off that we can't afford, right? It's not that we can't technically afford it, it's that we're making a judgment there. And so I think that's as close as I can get to an answer without.
Well, I think that's very insightful. So thank you, Rupin. We appreciate that. And you know what? Our time together has come to an end. So thank you to our audience members for joining us for this discussion on literacy and equity in North Carolina. There is much work to be done to move our state forward with literacy, but I'm encouraged by all the effort that's being put into literacy right now and through it with our leaders. And I'm very encouraged by that. And we hope you'll share the recommendations in this brief to keep the dialogue going. And also, please give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And we hope that you all have a great evening, and we hope that you take care of yourselves and each other. So thank you so much for being here.